I read in a book once that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, but I've never been able to believe it. I don't believe a rose would be as nice if it was called a thistle or a skunk cabbage. So said Anne Shirley in Anne of Green Gables. Which, I want to say, my job is done here. You heard an Anne Shirley quote. You should be at happiness and peace, right? Maybe not. But I do think that she's right on this one, that a rose would hardly be as nice if it was called a skunk cabbage. You see, words have great power. Anne, who is an authoress or an author, is very familiar with the power of words. And if you've read these books or if you've seen the movie, you know that there are two very powerful words for Anne. One that causes great pain, carrots, and caused her great anger every time she heard it, and she was particularly sensitive about her red hair. And so every time she heard this word, it brought instant rage in her heart and mind. And then there's another word that was extremely powerful. It had the power to transform her life forever, and that word is adopted. That she, as an orphan child, when she was finally adopted, found success and love and joy and hope and possibility. And so her life was then changed for the better. Words, you see, have a great deal of power. There's a song on Christian radio that you may have heard once or twice. It's a band called Hawk Nelson, and they say, "Words can build you up, words can break you down, start a fire in your heart or put it out." You see, words can hurt sometimes, and sometimes words can inspire. Words are incredibly powerful, and it's important then that we use our words carefully. And so with all of this in mind, Pastor Don has laid out for us a new sermon series to help us think about the words that we use. Over the next several weeks, we'll be talking about words and having us really think deeply about the words that we use and the way that we use them. As Don was thinking about which words we should choose in this series, the line that you probably know well from weddings or other church events maybe, came to his mind, and now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love. Faith, hope, and love abide, and the greatest of these is love. And so over the next 3 weeks, we're going to unpack these words and talk about how to use them more intentionally and with care. Faith, hope, and love. If you were here last week, you heard Pastor Don talk about other words that we have trouble with in church. How the phrase, the 12 days of Christmas, has changed over time. In old, ancient Victorian England or medieval times England, they used the 12 days of Christmas to be from Christmas Day until Epiphany, which is tomorrow. But we often think of that song, the 12 Days of Christmas, as being the 12 days before Christmas. And so I tell you this, one, to say the reason we still have our Christmas stuff up is that it's not yet Epiphany, and we'll take it down after sometime this week to remember Epiphany. But two, to say that words and traditions and seasons sometimes change over time, and we don't always understand our words. Last week also, Don cautioned us to think about the depths that words carry. So he talked a lot about energy and how many meanings energy has. And ultimately, scientists sometimes say, we don't even know what energy is. We know what it does, but we don't know what it is. And similarly, faith is such a big concept that we need to spend a lot of time thinking about what it means. Philip Yancey, in his book, What's So Amazing About Grace, shares the importance of words as he writes, "As a writer, I play with words all day long. I toy with them. I listen for their overtones. I crack them open and try to stuff my thoughts inside. I found that words tend to spoil over the years, like old meat. Their meaning rots away. Consider the word charity, for instance. When the King James translators contemplated the highest form of love, they settled on the word charity to convey it. Nowadays, we hear the scornful protest, "I don't want your charity." But it's true, if you go back to the King James Version, you'll find that it says, "And now abideth faith, hope, and charity," these three, "and the greatest of these is charity." And yet, as Yancey put it, charity is a word that whose meaning has rotted away, perhaps as vivid and gruesome as an image that it is. It's rotted away like old meat. And so we must be careful with the words that we use and consider their meaning not just for what it means, but also for its current context. You wouldn't, for instance, want to go to England or the United Kingdom and ask for a napkin at dinner, because a napkin is a diaper there. And so you wouldn't ask for that in the wrong context, because you wouldn't want to receive those results. It's not a word that you'd say has rotted with age, but simply a word that has had a different meaning based on context. And so it's important then that we consider the context for the important words that are found in our beloved chapter of 1 Corinthians 13. It's a chapter that you likely are very familiar with from weddings. I've even heard it read at a funeral or two, and it's a beautiful chapter, perfect for describing love at weddings. But it's not really about romantic love. Instead, it's a chapter that guides our interactions as a faith community. Ultimately, this is part of a longer letter that was written to the city of Corinth. Corinth is in Greece. It's on a very narrow strip of land. It was a port city, an important city in the first century, because this is a zoomed up version of Corinth. You can maybe see that there's a blue ribbon in the middle of the two land masses. They dug a canal, and you can still see the archaeological evidence for this, a canal that went right through Corinth, and it helped them to get ships from one side to the other, as canals do. And so it made Corinth a really important city. And this matters because Corinth had lots of different cultural influences, lots of different religious influences that all of the people saw all of the time and were always experiencing. Try to imagine, if you will, a world where not everybody believes the same that you do, where there are lots of different opinions and ideas about how to faithfully follow religion, lots of different political ideas in the world. And so in the midst of all of these differences, you can guess that community, solid, happy community, was hard to achieve. And so Paul spends this whole letter writing to the Corinthian church about how to get along better. A lot of Paul's letters talk about theology, and they start with theology, and then he gets into how to live out the theology practically. But the letter to the Corinthians starts with practicality and then puts theology in it. So he addresses all sorts of church fights that they were having. Good thing we don't have any of those ever. And he says, he talks to them because they were arguing about who was better because they'd been baptized by this person or this person. And they were arguing about improper relationships that were going on in the church. They were arguing about what food should be eaten, whether they could eat food that had been sacrificed to idols or not. And they were arguing about all sorts of things, how to take communion or the Lord's Supper, and arguing about what resurrection meant for them in their context right now. So in the midst of all of this church fighting, their biggest fight was who had the best spiritual gifts. And in the middle of trying to unpack this particular church fight about who had the best spiritual gift, Paul then writes this beautiful chapter on love. So it turns out, when you look at it in context, It's not really a chapter for Valentine's Day with its great explanation on love. It's really a chapter for today, like right after Christmas, after we've been given gifts. If you found yourself thinking, he or she got a better gift than I did, then this is the day that you need to read 1 Corinthians 13, because Paul reminds us that we're not to be jealous about other people's gifts. Instead, we're supposed to regard everyone with love. And more important than learning how to love one another, though that's key in the chapter, it's about understanding that God is love. And that this chapter is also about understanding how God treats all of us, that God is patient and kind and merciful and loving. And I think that you could argue that faith, hope, and love are important not only for how we should live, but also how we understand our relationship with God. That these words matter not only for living with one another, but also for how to reflect God's character in the world. And so then, as we turn back to thinking about the power of words, I want to share a quote with you from C.S. Lewis. See, this is a good sermon. You got Anne of Green Gables and C.S. Lewis. This is a rockin' sermon. And C.S. Lewis once wrote, and I know it's really small there, so I'll read it out loud for you. Don't use words too big for the subject. Don't say infinitely when you mean very. Otherwise, you'll have no word left when you want to talk about something truly infinite. And I think the same might be said for faith and hope and love. Maybe we don't always use these words in the best way. Maybe we've weakened these words so that we have no word left to describe our beliefs. For instance, when you say, I love M&Ms, in the same way that we say, I love Jesus, and maybe more passion put on the M&Ms than on Jesus, then it's time to reevaluate what we mean by the word love. Or again, with the word hope, if you say, I hope it's really sunny on Saturday, in the same way that you say, I hope that one day Jesus will return, we have a problem with the way that we use our words. Of course, the problem, the ultimate problem, is that our language is limited. There's only one word for hope and one word for love and one word for faith, but each of these has so many different meanings, and so we need to spend time thinking and reflecting on these words. And so I have for you on this first Sunday of January a challenge, a faith challenge for you. In the back, you'll find a basket of rocks. And I want you to, if you're up for the challenge, to take a rock and also take one of these green sheets of paper. And there's directions on one side, and then there's a list of words on the other side. I want you to look at the list of words and pray over this list of words, and then think about a one-word faith resolution that you might write on that rock, that you might put it in a prominent place and think about it, that it would be a prayer reminder to practice gratitude or practice forgiveness or practice love or whatever word you choose. And as you pick that word and focus on it, I hope that it will be a way to help us focus on the power of words and to really think about all of the ways that this one word, the many meanings that this one word might have. You see, sometimes we get lost in trying to say too much to God or letting our words pile up, but maybe one word is really all we need. And so your challenge is to choose this one word and focus on it this year and say, I'm going to think about how to love well or forgive well or experience God's grace. I want to, before we close, I'm almost done, tell you one more story. In the end of this passage, Paul says that we see in a mirror dimly, that we only ever see glimpses of the perfect Christian community. If 1 Corinthians 13 is about how to love as a Christian community, we generally only see glimpses of it. But this week, I experienced a beautiful glimpse of what I think heavenly community is supposed to be like, or that God is calling us to. And so I want to tell you this story. When I was in college, I was part of this Christian fellowship group. It was a lot more than that, but there it is, and you're welcome for the old picture of me. And so there it is. We had this group, and they were deeply committed to living out their faith, deeply faithful people. And I really learned a lot and grew a lot in my faith during these years. And over my 4 years there were roughly 30 people that were deeply involved in the group that I knew and that were really committed leaders. And of those 30 that I knew, I counted up 10 that went into full-time ministry for at least a year or more. So it was an impressive group, and we had this really great leader whose picture I don't have for you, but we had a really great leader that helped and guided us and led us and inspired us. And this week, I learned on New Year's Day that his family experienced a great, great tragedy. Their oldest daughter died in a car accident. And what happened after that is what I want to share with you and focus on, is that this Facebook group instantly formed. A great big message on Facebook went out. And people started sharing ideas. What can we do to give them comfort? And someone said, I have a vacation house that they could borrow, and we just need to raise money for a plane ticket. And suddenly, without much effort at all, different people had given over $1,000 toward this family so that they could go and have a retreat space to grieve the loss of their daughter. And what was amazing to me is that it's been nearly 20 years since I graduated. And 20 years later, with nearly zero contact with all of these people, they came together in this moment and said, we want to show God's love to this family that gave us so much. And I think that is what Christian community is really all about. And I know that this story is not unique, that you've all had moments like that you've experienced in your lives. But I think those moments are the ones that we really need to remember. It's so easy to think about the moments when Christian community is falling apart and when we're like that church in Corinth having church fight after church fight. But Paul is asking us to remember something greater, something bigger, something where love really puts on skin and walks around and gives us a big hug. And I think that every once in a while we get to see it, and it's exciting when we see it. And so this week, I challenge you to think about your words, to think about how we can faithfully live, but most of all, remember that when we receive God's love, we're called to give it out. That as we see in a mirror only dimly, only glimpses of what God's heavenly community looks like, we strive to live out this faith and hope and love, and hope to see it fully embodied in our lives. Let's pray together.